What up guys, Joachim here, and in this video we're going to talk a little bit about this motu proprium that Pope Francis of the Vatican Catholic Church, has issued, restricting and probably an attempt to eventually end what is called the traditional Latin Mass, or the Tridentine Mass. So the Tridentine Mass is composed largely of a more ancient Mass that was done by the Latin Rite, the Western churches, and it includes a lot of the more ancient liturgies that would have been done. It actually comes from the Middle Ages, but it is based on earlier masses going back much older than that extended out into the western part of the Roman kingdom. So as you probably know, there's the western part of the Roman kingdom and there's the eastern part of the Roman kingdom. So the Roman Empire, that is, not kingdom, it's an empire. So the Eastern Empire would be what is today known as the Orthodox Church. We would have said we were the Roman Catholic Church, that we were both Roman and we were the fullness of the church, meaning from the Catholic word katholu, or fullness, that the complete church is found in our church. And then the western part of the empire would have said the same thing, that they were both Roman and that they were the Catholic Church. So today, and at least in English, when we're in America, we will say Catholic, and it usually refers to the Vatican. And if we say Orthodox, it usually refers to the Eastern Empire. There are some mixing of those terms, but that's kind of the norm, at least. So we from the Eastern churches, at least, obviously, as you can tell from my accent and from my language, I'm an I'm a Western person. I grew up in the United States, but I'm part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so in the Orthodox Church, we typically do the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. Sometimes the liturgy of St. Basil is done several times a year, which is very similar. It's the same liturgy. There's a few additional parts that is added to that. And then very rarely we will do the liturgy of St. James, which comes from the 1st century. That's the brother of Christ, St. James. And he was the first bishop of the church in Jerusalem. He's the one who stands up in the book of Acts in chapter 15, and he has some leadership role in leading that particular council, which is the first, what we would think of as like an ecumenical council. It brings all of the bishops and people from various parts of the kingdom together for the purpose of deciding a particular subject. Well, so that gives a little bit of history of some of the liturgies. The Tridentine Mass supposedly is based on some of those Western liturgies. Within the Orthodox Church, we also do the Western Rite, which is, we usually use the liturgy of St. Gregory the Great, and it's been translated, so we always do liturgies in the language of the people. And I've actually wondered about that, so for some of these, they call them trad Catholics, traditional Catholics, they do like the Latin Mass, and I understand that, and it's like the Tridentine Mass, but the actual tradition is to do it in the language of the people. So I've always wondered, if they're really traditional, they're really following those traditions, why don't they just do the Latin Tridentine Mass in English? That would make more sense for an English-speaking people. That would be the tradition of the Catholic Church, would be to do it in the language of the people. Now, obviously, in the Middle Ages, they moved away from that, but the reason that the liturgies and the writings were done in Latin was to accommodate the West to begin with. So the apostles, obviously, they would have been accustomed to Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. So in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus reads from what he calls a book, and he cites passages that are only found in the Septuagint. They're not found in the Hebrew text, at least not the one that we have today. So that's kind of a significant thing, because it shows that at least Jesus was reading, at least in that particular synagogue, from a Greek text, because Greeks used books. Hebrews, the Jewish people, they used scrolls, and that's kind of followed down the tradition today. If you go to a synagogue, they will process around the synagogue using a scroll, and if you go to a Orthodox Christian church, they'll process around the inner part of the nave, using a book, and the book will be the books of the Gospels, and it's usually like coated in some kind of like gold, or maybe not real gold, but like a metal, and it's very ornate, the same way that scrolls are done in synagogues. So this showed like a common kind of origin, I guess, for that particular practice. But when Jesus reads from the book, it shows that he's using Greek. Well, why did they begin to use Greek in the Christian church? Because it was the language of the people. So they chose to do Greek instead of Hebrew, because it allowed the people to understand what was being said in a language that they used. Well, this probably was true in the West too, because Greek was the lingua franca throughout the Empire of Rome. As Latin became more the predominant language, with Greek being spoken less and less. People didn't understand Greek, so they accommodated that by using Latin as the lingua franca of the people in the Western Empire. Well, then you see that in like Celtic people. So there's not a lot of Celtic writings, but we know that there was a Celtic liturgy that was done, or a Gaelic liturgy. So they're called the Gauls, the Gaelican people. And we know that they had liturgy and prayers and things that were done in their language, in the Gaelic language. And this kind of is true throughout most of the early centuries at least. And then so in the West, they moved towards this idea of using Latin for all of the liturgies, all of the writings, and they didn't seem to care, at least by the Middle Ages, if the people understood or not. It had to be done in Latin. So that is most certainly a movement away from the church, at least in the early centuries, of doing things in the language of the people. But so if you're really a traditional Catholic looking back to the earlier church, then you should be doing things in the language of the people. So I guess I understand like the Pope's decree, or whatever that you call this, the modus proprio, or I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, motu proprio. But he wants to do it in English, but I've never understood like why, if they're doing the Tridentine Mass, they didn't just do the Tridentine Mass in English. That would make a lot more sense to me personally. So that the thing that I think people are bothered by is that the current Mass, the Norvus Ordo, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly either, but the Norvus Ordo, the current Mass that is typically done, at least in English, and that is done, I think, kind of throughout the Catholic Church worldwide, people don't really see that as a traditional like Catholic Mass. That is like kind of modernism. That's New Age kind of movement of Christianity. And so they really object to this movement of the Pope, which seems to be forcing them to accept that as the Mass of the Catholic Church. And it's funny, I've made a few jokes like Pope Francis is he's addressing the shortage of priests in the Catholic Church by making heresies so that people leave and things like that. And that's kind of a stupid joke, but it actually is kind of true though. Like there's a shortage of priests, and there's obviously tons of people leaving the church over things like this. It seems that the Pope Francis, on all accounts, seems to hate the traditional Catholic. Like he seems to have disdain against people that have come before him, against what has traditionally been Catholicism, and he is full well on wanting to accept modernism and create a... And so one of the things that kind of confuses me about the way that I guess both really traditional Catholics and just the average normie Catholic I guess looks at the Pope is that probably both in this case, in this particular scenario, with with his restrictions on the traditional Tridentine Mass, is that the church has this doctrine that he sits in the seat of Peter, that when he makes decrees, he's infallible. And so the comments that you see from many of these traditional Catholics is that he's wrong, that he's done something awful, and they're really starting to sound a lot like the reformers, the Protestant reformers, that is, and people that rejected the decrees of the Catholic Church 500 years ago, that It was around 500 years ago, 500 to 600 years ago. And, they're noting all these problems, these problematic theologies, things that were not true, reforms that needed to happen. But if you really believe that he is infallible, and these conversations always, I don't know what to say, they de-escalate into, or they spiral downward into this argument of whether he sits in the seat, when he sits in the seat of Peter, then he's infallible, or the whole thing is like making this huge defense about why the Pope in fact is not infallible. But I mean, that's what the teaching is. So I mean, like, if you have to spend most of your time defending why this is not true and that everyone just misperceives it, well, maybe it's actually just the teaching that's wrong. Maybe like your understanding, maybe universally the whole world's understanding of the teaching about the infallibility of the Pope is not the problem. Maybe it's actually just the teaching itself. Maybe he's actually not the vicar of Christ in the way that the church understands it. Maybe you guys are wrong about some of this, and that you should really look into the ancient church and the understanding of way like the Orthodox Church understands the patriarchs and the bishops of the church, that Christ is still the head. So like in the Catholic Church, the Pope is the head of the church, but in the Orthodox Church, Christ is the head of the church. And I mean, that's just the way we view it. So the bishops are the church, and that's just what's written by the church fathers. I don't remember which church father wrote that, but they wrote that wherever the bishop is, that's where the church is. So we represent the body of Christ, and the church, the body of Christ, is around the bishop, and that's what the Pope is. He's just a bishop, or he should be that. That's really not the way that the Catholic Church understands him to be, though, and that's why some of these things are so problematic when they reject his decrees and say that he's wrong, but then they also want to understand that. So I've had Catholic friends and people that contacted me with questions about the Orthodox Church because they are now kind of seeing some of the problems with this, and they're interested in moving over and coming to the Holy Orthodox Church. And I think that in most cases, if you're a traditional Catholic, or somebody that looks back at the church and wants to maintain the truth of the early church for at least the first 1,000 years, then you'll find a good home in the Orthodox Church. But if you're still on the Kool-Aid that the Pope's infallible, and you're swallowing that pill, then that might be a difficult move for you. But there's a couple of really good books. There's 2 books that were written by a former Catholic priest who was tasked. It was French. I wish I could remember his name. It would help out with this video. Maybe I'll put it in the description box below. But the 2 books that I know of that really address this kind of spearheaded pointedly, and because the man was a Catholic priest formerly and then converted and became an Orthodox priest, that his writings are notable. He was actually tasked by Rome to look into the history of the papal supremacy, or the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome. And the books that he wrote were the Schismatic Papacy and the Heretical Papacy. And I think he makes very good cases in that. But anyways, that's just kind of all I had to say on that, and I will talk to you guys in the next video.